What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
"You're not getting a cent," my mother snapped, loud enough for the wine glasses to shiver on the table and the entire room to go quiet in a heartbeat. It wasn't a quiet moment of family tension like most families might know. It was a public execution, a theatrical blow meant to humiliate me, and she timed it perfectly right as the cake was brought in, candles flickering. And people were settling into that false warmth that only happens at events where no one really wants to be there, but shows up anyway because it's expected. Every head turned. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Even the neighbor, old Mrs. Hanley, who hadn't heard her own front doorbell in 3 years, looked up from her glass with mild interest. I didn't flinch. Not even a twitch. I had waited for this moment. I had rehearsed it in the mirror, in the car, in my sleep. I stood slowly, without drama, without anger, and reached into my handbag for the red folder I'd carried for over 10 months, a folder that weighed more than paper should ever weigh, filled with contracts, letters, statements, and one particularly damning page signed in blue ink by my father, a man who had died thinking he left behind peace, not war. I looked her in the eye, her smug little grin already beginning to twitch at the edges. "That's fine," I said, my voice steady like I was reading a grocery list. "My lawyer will handle the transfer of your mortgage tomorrow." There was a pause, not the silence of confusion, but that dead, crackling quiet when everyone senses something has just shifted and no one knows whether to pretend they didn't hear it or brace for the impact. Linda, I refused to call her mom in these moments, went pale under her foundation. Her hand, the one gripping her wine glass like it was the only thing keeping her standing, began to tremble just enough to spill 2 red drops on her perfectly ironed cream tablecloth. For once in her life, she didn't have a rehearsed answer. The reactions came slowly at first. A loud, "What the hell?" from my cousin Chad, who never really paid attention to anything unless it involved football or barbecue. A half-muttered prayer from Aunt Belinda, who always tried to keep up the illusion that we were a wholesome American family, God-fearing, forgiving, and loyal. And then, my younger brother Ryan stood up, his chair scraping back with a metallic groan that only made the tension worse. His face was a picture of confusion and disbelief, and a little fear. Because he knew, somewhere deep down, that he was about to find out things he was never supposed to know. But I wasn't speaking to them. Not yet. I had only one target. You see, the thing people forget about long-term manipulation, the kind that wraps around your brain like ivy and whispers that you're selfish for wanting a normal life, is that it doesn't work forever. Sooner or later, if you're lucky or stubborn enough, you start pulling the roots out. One by one. And I had been doing just that for the last 3 years. But let me rewind for a second. Because if you're going to understand why this moment matters, you need to understand what came before it. You need to know how I went from being the daughter who dropped everything to care for a dying father and a bitter mother, to the woman standing in front of 25 people, holding a folder that could gut a house in one clean legal motion. I was 39 when my father got sick. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. One of those diagnoses that sounds like a prison sentence with no parole. I left my job in Minneapolis, a job I loved and had built from scratch, to move back into the house I grew up in, a beige 2-story colonial in rural Pennsylvania that hadn't been updated since Clinton was in office. My brother Ryan was finding himself out west, which mostly meant bartending in Tahoe and sending the occasional drunk voicemail. And my mother, Linda, well, she had never been the type to get her hands dirty. She played the part of the grieving wife like a seasoned actress. People brought casseroles. She smiled with sad eyes and said thank you. But the truth was uglier. Dad and I did everything. Medication schedules, hospital visits, insurance paperwork. I learned how to administer morphine and how to lie to a man I loved when he asked if it would get better. I held his hand while he cried. I wiped his face when he couldn't hold down food. And all the while, Linda complained about how tired she was. I didn't complain. I couldn't afford to. I took over the mortgage when they fell behind, because the house was technically in both of their names, and Dad had confided in me once, just once, that he didn't want it foreclosed if something happened. That was the first thread I pulled. Then came the tax records. The bank accounts. The credit card debts I hadn't known existed but had my name on them. The day he died, I found a letter in the back of his desk. No envelope. Just folded, with my name on it in his shaky handwriting. Inside, a copy of a will, his will, naming me as sole beneficiary. He wrote that he knew Mom would do what she does best and twist it all. He begged me not to let her. He said I had already given up enough, that the house should be mine. But when the official will went through probate, there was a different version. A newer one. Dated only 6 months before his death, with a shaky signature and suspicious language. Suddenly, everything was split between me and Ryan, with Linda retaining lifetime rights to the property. When I confronted her, she laughed in my face and said, "You should have known he'd want it fair." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I called a lawyer the next morning. And for 10 months, while she played queen of the castle, throwing brunches and gossiping about my attitude, I worked quietly. I got my own forensic handwriting expert. I pulled bank statements. I tracked every payment I made on that mortgage. I found out the truth about what she did and what she took. And now, on her birthday, surrounded by the people she wanted to impress, I handed her the folder and said 10 simple words that would change everything. "My lawyer will handle the transfer of your mortgage tomorrow." She opened it, shaking hands and all, and saw the foreclosure documents, the forensic report, the proof of forgery. Her face fell apart in real time. Ryan looked at me like I'd just burned the house down. But I hadn't. I just turned off the gas she'd left leaking for years. And that was only the beginning. It's funny how, in some families, dysfunction doesn't come at you like a wrecking ball, loud and obvious and easy to point fingers at, but rather seeps into your bones like slow, undetectable poison, dripping day after day through quiet judgments, subtle favoritism, and the kind of manipulation that disguises itself as love, until one day you wake up and realize you've been living inside a carefully constructed lie, one that was built on your back, while everyone else sat comfortably on the rooftop sipping iced tea and pretending not to notice the strain in your spine. For as long as I can remember, my mother made it clear, without ever really saying it out loud, that my brother Ryan was the one meant to shine, the golden child, the charmer, the good son who could do no wrong. Even when he left home at 20 with a pile of maxed-out credit cards and nothing more than a vague plan to work in music, which quickly turned into bartending in Lake Tahoe, couch hopping, ghosting family calls, and only resurfacing when he needed something. Money, bail, or, once, just validation that he hadn't screwed up his entire life. And every time he reappeared, tanned and tired and full of excuses, our mother would fawn over him like he'd just returned from combat, completely ignoring the chaos he left in his wake, and I, the one who stayed, the one who picked up the pieces, became invisible in plain sight. I didn't used to resent it, not at first, because back then I still believed that love meant sacrifice, that being the responsible one was something noble, something to be proud of, even if it meant you were always last on the list. When I came home to take care of Dad, it wasn't because I wanted to be the hero, it was because I knew no one else would, especially not Ryan, and I couldn't bear the thought of him suffering alone, not after everything he had done for us when we were younger. The baseball games, the camping trips, the quiet way he used to put his hand on my shoulder when I was scared. But those memories didn't hold up well under pressure, and as the weeks turned into months, and the house grew heavier with illness, silence, and my mother's constant humming of old church songs in the kitchen while doing nothing of actual help, I started to see the pattern that had always been there, only now it was sharpened by exhaustion and the cruel intimacy of death. The day I took over the mortgage wasn't some grand gesture. It was survival. The bills were piling up, the bank had already called twice, and I was the only one with a steady income and decent credit. Dad had stopped being able to speak clearly by then, but I remember how he squeezed my hand when I told him I'd taken care of it. There was relief in his eyes, gratitude, and maybe a little shame. He knew what it meant, even if no one else did. He knew I had just tethered myself to this house in a way that would be hard to undo. My mother, of course, acted like it was the most natural thing in the world, like this was simply what daughters did for their families. She didn't say thank you. She didn't even pretend to be grateful. She just smiled, that tight-lipped smile she reserved for moments when things were going her way, and said, "Your father would be proud," as if that absolved her from any responsibility. And then, within a week, she was hosting book club meetings in the dining room again, walking around like a queen in a castle she didn't even own anymore, because the truth was, after the refinance, the house was in my name, not hers. She had signed it over in a moment of desperation, probably not even realizing what she was giving away, or maybe she did and assumed I'd never use it against her. That's the thing about manipulators. They rely on the fact that you'll keep playing your role, even when you've stopped believing in the script. Ryan didn't know any of this, of course. He never asked. He'd call maybe once a month, always breezy, always talking about some new opportunity or girl or music project that was really about to take off, and every time, Mom would light up like a kid at Christmas, pressing the phone to her ear like she was clinging to a lifeline. She never told him about the debt, about the hospital bills, about the nights I sat in the dark doing math on a notepad trying to figure out how we were going to get through the next 6 weeks without defaulting on something. She protected his fantasy because it made her feel like a good mother, and I was the price of that illusion. It all came to a head about 3 months after Dad died. We were cleaning out the attic. Well, I was cleaning. She was sitting on a folding chair drinking sweet tea and pointing at things, and I found a box labeled legal. Inside was a file of old wills, insurance policies, tax forms, and one envelope marked with my father's handwriting, thick and shaky. I opened it, and inside was the original will, the one he'd written and signed the year he got diagnosed, leaving everything to me: the house, the savings, even his beat-up truck. There was a note, too, handwritten on yellow paper, that said, "She won't like this, but you earned it. You kept us together. Don't let her rewrite the story." I felt something snap in that moment. Not anger, not yet, but something colder. A clarity I hadn't felt in years. I didn't say anything right away. I just tucked the will back into the envelope, finished cleaning, and went back downstairs. My mother was laughing at something on the phone, probably Ryan, and when she looked up at me, she had that same smug look she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. And for the first time in my life, I didn't flinch. I didn't shrink. I just looked at her and thought, "You really think I'm still the girl who needs your approval?" That night, I started researching estate law. I booked a consultation with a probate attorney. I made copies of the will. I ordered certified statements from the bank. I pulled every document that tied me to that house and made sure they were bulletproof. Because I knew that when the time came, she'd try to take it all away, with that same sweet voice and that same smile that had fooled everyone for decades. But not me. Not anymore. And when the hammer finally dropped, when she brought out that fake will 6 months later and tried to act like it was all fair and equal, like we were just one happy family sharing a legacy, I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I just smiled, nodded, and let her think she'd won. Because I knew something she didn't. The house she lived in wasn't hers. And the next move was mine. Grief has a way of distorting time, stretching some moments into eternities and condensing others into blinks. So, in the weeks following my father's funeral, the days seemed to collapse into each other like poorly built dominoes, one toppling messily over the next, with no rhythm, no clean fall, just chaos softened by casseroles from distant relatives and the hollow sympathy of neighbors who acted like offering a potted plant could erase the sheer brutality of watching someone you love deteriorate from something as merciless as pancreatic cancer. The house, which had once carried the scent of old coffee, laundry detergent, and my father's aftershave, now smelled like Lysol and grief, sterile, heavy, and absolutely indifferent to the memories it contained. The funeral itself was small, which suited him. He wasn't a man of spectacle. He hated suits, hated attention, and once told me during one of his lucid moments that he hoped no one would cry too much or say any of that flowery crap, which made me smile, even as I sat in the front row, holding my mother's hand and wondering if she felt any of what I did, or if she was just rehearsing the performance she would soon deliver, the widow's mask she would wear for sympathy, attention, and maybe, deep down, some twisted sense of personal vindication. Because that's who she was, always had been, not overtly cruel, not the kind of mother who screamed or hit or drank too much, but the kind who would chip away at you slowly, gently, until you weren't sure which parts of you were real and which were just responses to her constant, calculated disapproval. The day after we lowered him into the ground, while the last of the floral arrangements wilted in the summer heat and the lasagnas sat untouched in the fridge, she called a family meeting, as if we were shareholders in some kind of emotional corporation. Ryan had flown in the night before, all fake tan and performative sadness, acting like the prodigal son returned, even though he'd missed almost every call during our father's final weeks and hadn't set foot in the house in over a year. He hugged me tight, told me I looked tired, and then made some offhand joke about me being the new head of the estate, which was ironic considering what happened next. We sat in the living room, the same room where Dad used to fall asleep in his recliner while watching reruns of MASH *, the same room where I had spent hours reading to him when the pain meds blurred his vision. And Linda walked in holding a manila envelope and a stack of legal papers that, even from a distance, I could tell had been recently printed. Her voice was soft, almost trembling, but not with grief. It was that rehearsed tremble she used when she wanted to seem fragile, when she wanted to disarm and distract. "I just want everything to be fair," she said, placing the documents on the coffee table like she was offering us something precious and painful at once. "Your father made some changes before he passed. We talked. He didn't want conflict between you two." I stared at the top page, immediately noticing the header, Last Will and Testament, dated just 6 months earlier, printed in a font my father had never used, signed in a hand that looked familiar but off, like someone trying very hard to copy something without being caught. She began reading the highlights, her voice steady now, her act complete. According to this document, the estate would be divided evenly between Ryan and me, with residential and custodial authority remaining with her for as long as she lived, a polite way of saying the house was hers, regardless of the name on the mortgage. Ryan looked relieved, probably grateful he wouldn't have to argue over anything. He smiled, thanked her, and turned to me, expecting some kind of shared joy over the apparent generosity of our dead father. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stared at the paper, at the signature, at the perfectly aligned paragraph breaks and the notary stamp that looked too clean, too recent, too professional. I had seen the real will, the one Dad had written with me months before he got too sick to hold a pen steady, the one he had tucked inside that box in the attic next to our old tax returns and my elementary school report cards. That version, the original, was short, direct, and utterly unambiguous. Everything was to go to me: the house, the remaining savings, his car, and the dusty collection of antique coins he kept in the garage. Not because he loved Ryan any less, not because he wanted to punish my mother, but because he knew what I had given up, what I had endured, and what I had continued to carry alone, without complaint. I didn't argue in that moment, didn't accuse her, didn't confront her or pull out my copy and call her a liar in front of Ryan, though the urge to do so burned in my throat like acid. No, instead, I smiled, nodded, and excused myself from the room under the pretense of needing to lie down, knowing full well that the next steps would not be emotional, but strategic, calculated, and legally airtight. The following Monday, I sat in a polished office downtown, across from a probate lawyer named Trisha Lang, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, who listened carefully as I laid everything out in detail: the conflicting wills, the mortgage in my name, the timeline of Dad's illness, and the sudden, convenient appearance of a New Testament that contradicted everything he had written down and told me in his final weeks. Trisha didn't flinch. She'd seen this before, she said, more times than she could count: grieving widows faking signatures, adult children forging paperwork, families turning into war zones over property lines and retirement accounts. What she hadn't seen, though, was someone who had already gathered as much evidence as I had: photos of the original will, timestamps, dated letters, payment records on the mortgage, even a voicemail from Dad thanking me for taking care of the house stuff. His voice gravelly but unmistakable. "We can fight this," she said. eyes scanning the documents I'd brought. "And if everything checks out the way you say, we won't just fight it, we'll win." And from that moment on, the process began slow, quiet, and methodical. I didn't tell Ryan. I didn't confront Linda. I let them play their parts, let them believe the script was still in their hands, while behind the scenes I was rewriting the entire third act. Over the next few weeks, I hired a forensic handwriting expert who confirmed what I already suspected: the signature on the new will was not my father's, at least not in the condition he had been in 6 months before his death. I traced the notary listed on the document, only to discover she had notarized 10 documents for my mother in the same week, and when contacted, she hesitated just a little too long before confirming the will's legitimacy. Meanwhile, Trisha gathered records showing the mortgage legally was solely mine, meaning if I wanted to, I could initiate proceedings that would place the house under financial review and possibly even foreclosure, unless my mother agreed to settle privately. But I wasn't ready to pull the trigger yet. Not until I had everything. Not until there was no room left for doubt. Because this wasn't just about a house. This was about history, about all the quiet betrayals, all the stolen credit, the manipulation, the way she looked at me like I was a disappointment in a cardigan. This was about reclaiming something more valuable than property. This was about finally, after a lifetime of playing the obedient daughter, choosing to become the woman who doesn't ask for what's hers, but takes it. And when I did, it would be public. It would be irreversible. And it would be devastating. The thing about revenge, real revenge, the kind that doesn't involve shouting matches or impulsive gestures, but simmers slowly over months, sometimes years, is that it isn't about winning one battle or making a single dramatic gesture that flips the table and sends everyone gasping. It's about patience, about precision, about knowing exactly which pieces need to be moved and when. Like a game of chess where your opponent doesn't even realize they're playing until the king is already cornered. And the only thing left to do is tip it over in quiet resignation. That was the space I was operating in during those long, quiet months after my first meeting with Trisha Lang, as I moved silently through the days pretending nothing had changed, going through the motions with my mother like we were still the same dysfunctional pair, the helpful daughter and the burdened matriarch, while behind the scenes, I was laying brick by brick the foundation of a plan so complete, so deliberate, that by the time she would finally understand what I had done, it would be far too late for her to stop it. I spent those days in silence, keeping my head down and pretending, as always, to be the one keeping the peace, knowing full well that every smile I gave her, every nod, every polite exchange across the breakfast table was another nail in the coffin of the lie she had built. She had no idea that every time I took a phone call outside, it wasn't work or errands or some trivial conversation. It was me working with Trisha, sending scanned documents, affidavits, handwriting samples, notarized statements, property records, account histories, a relentless paper trail that pointed to one unavoidable conclusion. The will she had presented was a forgery. The mortgage she thought she had power over was legally mine. And the very house she woke up in every morning, smug and oblivious, was sitting on financial ground she no longer controlled. What made it almost poetic was how casually she carried herself during that period, walking through the house like a woman who believed she had truly won, talking on the phone with her friends about redecorating the guest room, as if she wasn't living in a structure that could, at any moment, be legally and publicly stripped from her. She'd parade Ryan around the neighborhood when he came to visit, acting like she had built something worth showing off, completely unaware that Ryan, while not my ally, was no longer her loyal son either. Because somewhere between the lines of one of our conversations, after a few too many glasses of red wine on a quiet Thursday night, I told Ryan about the original will. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't cry or shout. I simply said, "Dad left everything to me. I found his will. I have proof. Mom changed it." And then I let the silence stretch long enough for the idea to settle in. Ryan didn't believe me at first, or more accurately, he didn't want to. But I could see in his face, in the way his smile faltered and his eyes shifted, that a seed had been planted, and with every passing day, every suspicious action from our mother, it grew. He started asking her small questions, nothing that would tip her off, just breadcrumbs. When did Dad update the will again? Or who helped with the paperwork? And every time she stumbled through an answer, he looked a little more convinced. And while I never counted on Ryan to be a part of my plan, I wasn't above using him as a variable that could tip the balance. Trisha, for her part, was relentless. She knew that the most powerful lever in this situation wasn't confrontation, but pressure, real, legal, financial pressure. So, we began the process of initiating a quiet lien review, a methodical look into the property's ownership and financial status, knowing full well that once it reached the final stage, we could file for foreclosure proceedings under the grounds of default. Not because of missed payments, but because of a breach in the contractual agreement between me and the estate. In other words, we could legally evict my mother from the house she thought she owned, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it once the paperwork was processed. But I didn't want it to be that easy. No, that would have been a clean cut, and after everything she had done, she didn't deserve clean. She deserved to feel it unravel beneath her feet, to watch the life she'd built on stolen loyalty collapse one lie at a time, until the only thing she had left was the bitter knowledge that it had all been preventable if she had just told the truth. So I waited. I waited until the annual family dinner, not Thanksgiving, not Christmas, just one of those strange mid-year events she invented to show off for her friends and pretend that our family was still intact, like putting a fresh coat of paint over rotted wood. She invited everyone, cousins, neighbors, her church ladies, even Ryan, and she went all out, catered food, string lights in the backyard, fresh floral centerpieces on every table. She wore one of her best dresses, the kind she saved for weddings or high-stakes funerals, and she floated around the patio like the queen of a kingdom no one else respected. And I let her. I smiled, poured drinks, helped set the table. I listened to her brag about how she managed the house all on her own after George passed, biting my tongue so hard I tasted blood. I endured the fake compliments, the passive-aggressive remarks, the sideways glances from people who had no idea they were about to watch a woman's legacy get torn in half. And then, once the plates were cleared and the wine was flowing and the guests were relaxed and loud, she stood up at the end of the long table and raised her glass for a toast, saying something about family strength and resilience, and how despite all the hardship, we've come out stronger than ever. That's when I knew it was time. I stood as she was mid-sentence, my red folder already in hand, and I said nothing at first, just waited for her to look at me, for the chatter to die down. And whenever I turned my way, I said the words I had rehearsed 100 times, not loud, not angry, just steady, deliberate, and clear. That's fine. My lawyer will handle the transfer of your mortgage tomorrow. It was as if the temperature dropped 10 degrees. I opened the folder and laid it on the table, copies of the original will, the forensic report on the forged signature, the mortgage agreement, the lien review documents, everything. I didn't need to explain. The silence said enough. My mother stared at the papers like they were written in another language, her face paling, her fingers twitching slightly at her sides, and for the first time in my life, she looked small, not weak, not pitiful, but exposed. Vulnerable in a way that even she didn't know how to defend against. I didn't wait for her response. I turned and walked away, letting her sit there, letting the judgment and questions fall on her like rain. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was anxious, but because the quiet was so deep, so profound, that it didn't feel real. The years of carrying weight that wasn't mine had ended not with a scream, but with a sentence. A single sentence that changed everything. And yet, I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Because Linda had never been the type to go down quietly. And the next move? Well, I was ready for it. The morning after the dinner, or rather, the ambush, as I later heard some of my extended relatives whispering, began not with calls from my mother, as one might expect after publicly leveling her pride like a condemned building, but instead with an email from her lawyer, an older man named Bruce Holloway who had handled her affairs since long before my father's illness, and who, quite frankly, had always struck me as the kind of man who prided himself more on his golf handicap than his legal accuracy. The email, predictably, was laced with polite hostility, a weak attempt to assert control by suggesting we meet to clarify the status of the estate and property. As if decades of manipulation and months of legal maneuvering could be smoothed over with coffee and pleasantries at a conference table. I didn't respond immediately, not because I was avoiding the confrontation, but because, for the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to my mother's chaos like a soldier scrambling for cover. I was observing it, measuring its unraveling, letting her twist in the uncertainty she had cultivated for so long, now turned inward against her like a snake eating its own tail. I forwarded the message to Trisha, who called me back within the hour, her voice calm but tinged with the satisfaction of someone who knew they had the upper hand and was prepared to use it. "We'll meet on our terms," she said. "And we're not negotiating. We're informing." It was in that moment, hearing those words spoken without hesitation or compromise, that I realized just how deeply I had been conditioned to accommodate, to soothe, to explain myself into the ground for the sake of family harmony, or at least the illusion of it. That reflex had been dying slowly, chipped away with every document I uncovered, every truth I faced, and now it was gone altogether. I wasn't the daughter anymore. I wasn't the scapegoat, the nurse, the financial fallback. I was the legal owner of the home she slept in, the holder of the Real will, and the only person in the room who had nothing left to prove. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, a neutral office downtown where Bruce arrived first, all thin smiles and casual condescension, pretending not to be rattled by Trisha's presence or the heavy folder she carried, even though he clearly knew he was outmatched. My mother entered shortly after, dressed in a way that made her seem smaller than usual. No pearls, no heels, no signature red lipstick, just a muted pantsuit and a jaw clenched so tightly I could hear it pop when she sat down across from me. She didn't greet me, didn't look at me. Just fixed her eyes on some invisible point above Trisha's shoulder, like she was willing herself to float away. Trisha opened the folder slowly, methodically, and laid out the evidence one piece at a time: the original will, notarized and dated, the forensic handwriting report discrediting the forged signature on the version Linda had filed, the notarization irregularities, the mortgage documents bearing my name and my payments, all of it lined up like soldiers ready for war. Bruce's face began to shift first, a subtle tightening around the mouth, a twitch near the temple, and I could tell, in that moment, he knew they were cornered. Not only had they lost the legal ground, they had lost the story, the narrative Linda had so carefully crafted over the years, the one where she was the dignified widow, the overwhelmed mother, the guardian of the family legacy. All of it was dissolving under the weight of facts she couldn't bend or reframe. Linda, for her part, said nothing. Not a word. Not when Trisha explained that we would be filing a quiet title action to officially strip her of any claim to the house. Not when we presented the affidavit from a family friend confirming my father's statements about the will. Not even when we told her that, barring a private agreement, she would be served with an eviction notice within 60 days. She just sat there, stone still, except for her hands, tightly clasped in her lap, knuckles white, shaking ever so slightly. I thought I might feel triumphant in that moment, victorious, vindicated, but what I felt was something heavier, something harder to name. It wasn't regret, not exactly, but there was a certain sorrow in realizing that justice, when delivered this late and this cleanly, can still feel like a funeral for something you once hoped could be saved. There was no shouting, no apology, no dramatic confession. Just the silent admission, painted across her carefully blank expression, that she had finally lost control. The weeks that followed moved quickly. She didn't fight the foreclosure proceedings. Bruce sent a proposal for a quiet settlement, offering to vacate the house in exchange for a small portion of the estate's liquid assets, which Trisha flatly refused on my behalf. Linda had no choice but to leave. She packed up over the course of 3 days, never once speaking to me directly, never asking for understanding or mercy or even acknowledgement. Ryan helped her, though I could see in his face, in the way he avoided my eyes and kept his voice low, that his faith in her had been fractured, perhaps beyond repair. He called me only once after it was all over, asking if I was okay, and when I told him yes, he sighed and said, "I think she believed she was doing the right thing, you know? In her own messed up way." Maybe she did. Maybe she thought rewriting Dad's wishes would bring the family closer. Maybe she believed I'd roll over, like I always had, and let her steal what wasn't hers. Or maybe, deep down, she just couldn't stomach the idea that I, the daughter she had always dismissed as too sensitive, too quiet, too ordinary, had been the one entrusted with something she believed should have been hers by default. In the end, she moved into a small apartment across town, and I stayed in the house, not out of sentiment, but because I had earned it, paid for it, fought for it, and because walking through those rooms no longer made me feel like a prisoner inside someone else's life. I repainted the kitchen, tore up the carpet in the hallway, replaced the curtains in the living room with something light, something clean. There was silence, of course, long stretches of it, especially at night, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of before. It was the kind that echoed with possibility. A few weeks later, while cleaning out the storage room, I found an old shoebox sealed with masking tape and marked simply with my name. Inside was a cassette tape, brittle with age, labeled in my father's familiar handwriting, for Dana in case she needs to hear it. I had to borrow an old tape player from the library to listen to it. When I finally heard his voice, soft and raspy, filtered through the scratchy hiss of the tape, I sat perfectly still, breath caught somewhere between grief and recognition. "If you're hearing this," he began, "then I didn't get to say everything I wanted to, but I want you to know I saw you. I saw everything. You were the one holding it all together. You were the one who stayed. And I'm sorry I didn't do more to protect you from her. I should have. I wanted to. I just didn't know how. But I knew you would. I knew you'd find a way." The tape ended there, with a pause so long I thought it had cut off, and then, finally, just a whisper, "Be free, kiddo." I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I didn't feel any one emotion clearly enough to name it. I just sat there, tape still spinning, and listened to the sound of the machine winding down. And in that stillness, I realized something I hadn't been able to see through all the rage, the pain, the strategy, something simple but true. Maybe blood binds us, but truth frees us. And maybe, just maybe, that's what justice really looks like. Not clean, not satisfying, not wrapped in a neat bow, but earned, lived, and survived. And maybe that was enough.